The culture talk today is by Venkat Srinivasan, head archivist now at NCBS. He will tell us about building up a public archive for the history of contemporary biology in India and how an archive is being redefined by some of the work that he's doing. He, in fact, isn't an archivist by birth or training. He was, in fact, a research engineer at the SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory at Stanford, where he realized that archival and archiving activities of scientists is perhaps an incredibly exciting thing to study and document. He's also an independent science writer. He's worked with work published in The Atlantic, Scientific American Online, Wired, and many other public-facing and communication fora. He's graduated with a master's in material science from Stanford and a master's in journalism from Columbia. So with that introduction to my colleagues who are going to give you a discussion about archives today, let me hand you over to Venkat Srinivasan.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this invitation, and hello, everyone. So my talk is titled Archives as Crucible, Archives as Commons, and I'm going to start with a letter from the archive. This is a letter from a person named Narayan Karangia, which was written on 30th July 1990 from the Kennedy village in Jamnagar district in Gujarat in Western India. And he's writing this letter after seeing a pamphlet near his farm somewhere called The Vanishing Floricans. And he writes this letter to the Bombay Natural History Society in Bombay, where he's saying that he's basically reaching out to them, asking them a little bit more about the floricans, telling them about the floricans that he's seen near his farm, and also discusses a little bit about his work as, besides his work in farming, as someone who protects peacocks and such. Now, on the face of it, there is nothing particularly extraordinary about the letter. It's a letter written by an individual to another organization. But what I want to talk about here is to sort of say that these letters do two things, right? So one is that every ordinary letter like this has a certain unlikely journey, and it enters the archive through a variety of unlikely sort of directions. In this case, it goes from the farm, it starts as a thought in his mind, and it starts off and it goes from post office to post office, going from city to city, eventually lands in the Bombay Natural History Society, where it sort of is sent over to the scientist who worked on it, whose name is Ravi Sankaran. And this letter is part of the Ravi Sankaran papers at the archives at NCBS. And it travels with Sankaran through wherever he goes through his career, and eventually lands in the archive because his family donated his material to the archive. And after this process, it eventually sort of sits in an asset-free folder in a box, and is made available to the public. So there is this very unlikely journey of going from a private thought into a very, very public space. And this journey is very sort of emblematic of most objects in the archive. And this is something that I just wanted to stress about how unlikely these journeys are. And the other thing that happens is that once it does do this, there are two things that happen. That there are decisions that the archive has to make, especially if it's thinking of itself as a public collecting center. And these decisions are around whose material enters the archive, who uses it, who describes it, who interprets the archive. Because once you have a letter like this that comes in, you start to see the various stories that emerge from it. That, this is a farmer named Narayan Karangia, who we understand is not just interested in farming, but also in peacocks, in advocacy, in ecological conservation, in floricans, as it were. There is the letter itself that starts to sort of show many stories that inhabit inside it. It's a letter about conservation, it's a letter about cooperation more than anything else. It's about outreach, and of course, there's an element of farming in it. So what we try and emphasize at the archives at NCBS are these two things. We say that archives are there primarily to enable a diversity of stories, and they're there, of course, to capture the context and process of science. So we're speaking from within the perspective of science. The journal article, of course, the published material is what the world knows most of the time. But there is this vast unpublished material that exists in everyone's labs and everyone's sort of notebooks and such. And this is really what enters the archive. And I'd like to argue that this is very pivotal to understanding, of course, how science happens, which is, of course, to say that the archives cannot exist without the science. There is no archive without the work of the scientific community. But I'd like to argue that there is no science without the work of an archiving community. And I mean archiving in a broad sense of the word, not necessarily an archive in a repository, as it were. So the archive at NCBS, which opened in February 2019, is a Center for the History of Contemporary Biology in India. We started out as an institutional archive initially, and then we decided that we can probably do something broader, and which is why we decided to go in this direction of becoming a public collecting archive. And the Sankaran papers, from which I shared the letter earlier, is an example of that collection model that we have here. This is an entrance to the archive, and this is our reading room. And like many other archives, most of the sister institutes in this conversation have much more established archive, and we've been in touch with them for support as well. This is the website to the archive. We have about 50,000 objects that are open to the public and about 18 different collections. But this is about what the archive does as a research center. The two things that I do want to talk about going forward is how we're trying to look at the archive slightly differently at NCBS. One is to really think of the archive as a crucible. And by crucible, I mean in various ways as a space to really get students from various kinds of backgrounds. We have students from over a dozen backgrounds who have come and spent time doing internships, anywhere between a month to 5 months. And we're really trying to build a culture of linking science, technology, history, and the arts through these conversations. We're not training them to be archivists. We work with whatever their background is, and we try and see how to bring an element of the archives, an element of science, an element of history, and really contextualize their work and contextualize science through their projects. For instance, we've had narrative projects by a couple of students who worked on the history of the fruit fly, which is now publicly visible on the Google Arts and Culture platform. We've done a few pop-up art exhibitions, as is the case of Aparna's exhibition on the right-hand side, looking at archiving the ephemeral. And in all these cases, again, we sort of look for that archival element and see how we can align their interests with some historical context. We try and make connections across disciplines. We are working on a really interesting project on looking at the ecological history of the country, thanks to the work of Hari Sridhar, a postdoctoral scholar. We're sort of visiting archival legal standards in this country, especially in this particular age of thinking about data privacy and individual data protection. We're working on quite an exciting project on semantic web, really rethinking description of archival objects on the web, and a couple of other projects that are mentioned here. As we go forward, there are a few other things that we imagine working on. In particular, there's a project, as I said, on digital annotations, which I will talk about in a couple of minutes. But the intent, as you see over and over, time and again, is to really sort of bridge these connections across disciplines and sort of really situate the archive as being a connecting space across these different disciplines that we've mentioned here. And sometime in 2021, we will be opening a history of science program, a history of science course that we will start out through the archive. So where this is going really is to sort of go towards thinking of the archives as commons. And we understand the word the urban commons quite commonly, but we never think of the archives as a commons. And in India in particular, perhaps it's especially true that the archives are seen as, of course, research centers, which they are. But we'd like to sort of open up that space and sort of bring awareness around what an archive can be and what it can do, and really democratize the space and think of it as a public, thriving space so that people engage with it, challenge it, and even critique it, instead of sort of assuming that what is there is the gospel. So you have to sort of question what enters the archive, because that will dictate what kind of knowledge gets produced after that. So this is a framework that we've put together to say that the archive really can sit at the center of these 4 silos that coexist but don't necessarily speak to each other very often. There is a scientific community, there are the historians of science, there are storytellers like poets, writers, playwrights, and there's of course the broader public. And we see the archive as this connecting ground across these different spaces. And we've had some evidence to seeing that this could work based on the visitors that we've had in the last year and the kinds of research uses that are mentioned on the right-hand side. We run a public lecture series, which is, as you can see, it's not rooted in the sciences, but it has an element of science and an element of history in the series. We started this in 2018. And each of these talks are, a way of asking a very simple question: how did we get here? So each of these themes that you see here, we invite distinguished people who talk about their body of work or service. And the image that you're seeing is about Gautam Bhatia's talk earlier this year on the history of the Indian Constitution. So each of these talks are really about trying to ask, how did we get to this point? And then we try and sort of peel layers of history, layers of science, and seeing the intersections between different disciplines through these talks. And we also have these speakers come and spend time with the students. So we have this, again, constant bridging of disciplines. This is an image of Shekhar Pathak, who was hanging out with the students for a couple of days nonstop, talking about his work as a historian in ecology in the Himalayas. A couple of other projects that we started this year include a podcast that we started called scrollsandleaves.com, which again looks at this intersection of science, culture, and history. A couple of episodes are already out, and we hope to have the remaining episodes of season 1 out in about a couple of months from now. And this is the work that's been led by Gayatri Vaidyanathan, Mary Rose Abraham, and Nikhil Nagraj. So if you have time, I do encourage you guys to go check it out. Scrollsandleaves.com is the website. We have a physical space in the archive, again, really sort of thinking of the archives as commons to say this is a space that you can come and hang out and think about the kind of stories that emerge from the archive. Our current exhibition is titled Herbs, Maps, and Medicine, which looks at an interpretive exhibition of commerce and spice, and the entire exhibition space is supposed to resemble a manuscript, and it's sort of looking at a marketplace of knowledge, as it were. So to summarize these ideas, what's going on here is really, probably well illustrated by Vaishnavi, who was a student intern in the archive and whose project was to sort of think of illustrated ways of representing the archive. And this was her way of saying that the archive is this sort of thriving co-working space effectively, and as I like to joke, without coffee. So we want to go now beyond the physical commons and sort of really think about the archives also in the digital commons. And this is work that we started earlier this year called the Milli Consortium, which is individuals and communities that are interested in the nurturing of archives in the country. And the idea is very simple, really. It is to sort of build a common digital platform to connect archives from across the country. They could be institutional, thematic, or individual private collections, and build a space for discovering material across these different repositories. Build a space to interpret the material. This is extremely important to say that we want to democratize how people describe and see the material. So you're not only limited by the archive's description, but you find your own ways of describing the material, and that becomes useful for someone else going forward. And finally, a story space, which is really geared towards high school and college students, to sort of see how stories emerge from these archival tools and archival repositories that are visible here. We're fairly confident that we build a model like this, people will start to see a certain importance and awareness around the material they have around them, and they will start to realize these connections that are possible once you build spaces like this. So I'd like to sort of wrap up in the way I started, which is to wrap with a letter again. This is an example of a letter in the Ubaid Siddiqui collection. Ubaid, as many of you would probably know, was a co-founder and the center director of the National Center for Biological Sciences, the first center director. And this is a letter that he received in the early 2000s. As you can see, there's not much on the cover to work with. So this managed to reach, despite what's mentioned here, this is all that was mentioned on the envelope. And the person who sent it, Hanan Ali Chachan, was based at the University of Mustan, Syria in Baghdad, Iraq. This was in the early 2000s. And Hanan Chachan has written this letter where they're asking this, basically saying that they're an MSc student and they basically need some assistance from Ubaid on a particular project that they're working on, the applications of the Leslie matrix, as it were. Now, it's a very simple letter. It's a letter that's sent out to a scientist saying, "Can you help me out?" Of course, it's an incorrect letter in the sense that Ubaid is not a mathematician, and despite everything else, of course, the letter does reach him. It goes from Bombay to Bangalore, as it is evident here. This was around the time that Ubaid was moving after NCBS had been set up here in Bangalore. And he responds back to Hanan Chachan saying, actually it's a typo. He says, "I'm not a biologist," when in fact he is a biologist. And he basically responds to say that I suggest you contact this other professor who might be able to help you out. Now, again, on the face of it, there's nothing particularly extraordinary, but the two things that are extraordinary are A, that it exists, that it has survived despite everything else. It has traveled from Baghdad with very minimal information, has been retained. Ubaid has made decisions on keeping this over a period of time. And I think we need to pay attention to what people find valuable over the course of their lives. And it starts to also, once it's here in the archive, once we've described it, really made it visible to the world, we start to see these other layers of stories, these layers of cooperation, of reaching out, student-professor relationships, of what Baghdad was like. And, you can start looking at the histories of Chachan in this process. And when I look at letters like this, I'm really reminded of Szymborska's quote in her Nobel Prize winning speech in the mid-90s, where she says that whatever we might think of this world, this measureless theater to which we've got reserved tickets, bounded as it is by 2 arbitrary dates, whatever we might think of it, it is astonishing. And I think that's what archival objects sort of show us time and again, that this world is astonishing, and the very fact that these objects live and are able to tell these stories is an astonishing thing. So with that, I would just like to thank the students and colleagues who have worked with us in the archive over the last 3 years. More than 3/4 of the names that you see here are students who have spent time with us. And I really appreciate the challenges they've sort of posed the archive and the way they've shaped the archive. And finally, of course, I'd like to thank our support structures and especially all our funding agencies that have made this work possible. So with that, I thank you for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Venkat. Archives as public spaces to illuminate science and science culture. That was a wonderful talk. Time for discussion. So the first question here is from Ron. Are there other biological archives elsewhere that you think are interesting and that could possibly provide inspiration for your model?
Yeah, I mean, just within the Sister Institute network, the Cold Spring Harbor has a fantastic archive. I've been in touch with them in the past. The EMBL, I mean, the archivist there, and I, speak quite frequently these days. I mean, once a month we have a standing conversation. We learn quite a bit from this network, and we actually are in close touch with many of these archives that are out there. And actually, the model that we talked about, having a consortium of archives, is really something that we hope other archives would be interested in, especially in the sciences, to say, let's do this, because it's technically very feasible. These are, it's really an administrative question at this point.
Well, speaking of technicality, as you know, the world is heading towards a digital mode of communication. So what will happen to all these communications? What will happen to all these archives when the world changes from physical letters to emails?
Not an awful lot, I think. So, I mean, I'd like to think of these as just different media that, we have gone from stone tablets to paper at some point. So, 100 years from today, we will basically reflect back to say that, there was a time when we were predominantly talking in paper and, we use whatever other mode of communication. The primary task, I think, of an archive, and so what I'd like to think about always is the harder task is in the hands of the person whose material is getting archived. So we individuals have to make decisions on what we keep and what we find important. The archive is only just responding to that process. So, the material will stay in servers, and this is, there's some really good work done out of Stanford University, looking at email records, for instance, and a variety of other universities that have done some really extraordinary work around this area. But I think the fundamental question will come back to the individual. What do we find important? Do we find that letter from the farmer important enough to hang on to it? So these are the kinds of things that I think we need to think about very carefully.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of which, what about curation? Because I would imagine that over a period of time, the letter from the farmer would probably get old. So have you thought about curating this? What are your steps for curating these material?
Yeah, so I mean, this is an excellent and a very problematic question that the archives, I think, have to think about. This is a global issue that all archives are curatorial ventures. I mean, the curation begins in the hands of the individual. Obaid makes a decision, Ravi Shankaran makes a decision, you and I make decisions on what we want to keep. The archive goes ahead further and makes those decisions, which are, sometimes you could argue are political in a broader sense of the word. And then it stays in the archive. Then the question really is, what kinds of description does the object have for it to thrive going forward? So an archival object without interesting description, the ways you can imagine other kinds of stories emerging from it, if it doesn't have that, then the object really doesn't live long enough. So, the farmer letter would probably not see the light of day if we were not paying attention to what kinds of stories can emerge from it. And I just use that as an example, but this applies to every single object in the archive. So it will continue to thrive in the curatorial world if we constantly, imbue it with our descriptions and imaginations.
True. So speaking of descriptions, you probably have a range of material to curate, from lab notebooks to photographs to written communications. So is there a standard process for archiving, and how do you go about creating digital annotations for all these different types of materials?
Right. So, I mean, the archival field is, very well established, and I hadn't mentioned this in my talk, but I'm extremely grateful for this community that is just extraordinarily generous in sharing information. So there are very clear guidelines on thinking about appraisal of material in the archives, about how to sort of describe it, how to make it visible. But the tools that we are thinking of, so going forward, the digital annotation tools, I think, which is what you were alluding to, is to really go beyond how an archive describes it, and to say, let's put some control in the hands of a visitor or a researcher, to say that a researcher will have a way of seeing it, and we should try and pay attention to how they interpret the material and figure out a way to get their interpretation back into the archive so that someone in the future can benefit from their way of looking at it. So these tools are relatively easy to describe. I mean, it's basically annotation. You can call it tagging, you can call it semantic web relationships. These tools are available and visible. It's just that we haven't applied it in this framework yet. I can go into this in detail if we have time.
Oh, we have time. If you'd like to elaborate on this, we'd be happy to hear from you.
Okay, so the annotation tools that we're trying to develop are basically a way of saying, you as users can look at the material, look at the archives, and if you register as a user and you log in and say that I've looked at this letter from the farmer, and you know what, I think I see other ways of describing it, and you basically tag it by location, by caption, by subject. And there are various things in the archival world called control vocabularies that you can use. So you use existing standardized vocabulary to describe the material. And that can be something that is vetted by the archives or vetted by a community of individuals. And once it is vetted through, it goes back into the database as another level of description. You can call it metadata if you like. It becomes another field that you're using to describe. So, for instance, if you notice a particular name in that letter, you'd say that, hey, you guys forgot to tag it with a location called Jamnagar. Here, let me do that for you. And so then in the future, when someone is looking at the history of ecological conservation in Jamnagar, they'll be able to find it. It's just a very, very simple idea, but it's very powerful once we build these as elegant, scalable tools, because it really opens up the avenue quite a bit. And of course, you can imagine how this will really sort of be powerful once you connect different kinds of archives. Imagine a way to connect a letter from Cold Spring Harbor to, say, a lab note from NCBS, for instance.
Mm-hmm. All right. Here's another question for you. Are there any interesting anecdotes that you would like to highlight from what you've come across in the process of archiving so far?
Well, I have this. I mean, most of them tie back to the objects. I'm just constantly struck by the possibilities of these objects. I've used this example quite a bit of a document that we have in the archive, which is written on Braille paper, and it's an ecological research document. It's a research document that looks at the population of tree-living mammals in South India. And when I got this document from the person who created this, Ajit, I asked him, what's it for? What do you have it? And he said it's a population of tree-living mammals. But honestly, when I looked at the document, I was not paying attention to what he was saying anymore, because I was struck by the fact that he was writing on a piece of Braille paper. And so I asked him, why are you writing on Braille? And so Ajit was very nonchalant about it. And he said, well, you have to understand that it was very hard to get good non-blotting paper doing field work in the early 80s in South India. And I needed good non-blotting paper. A colleague of his happened to be blind. And this colleague happened to also be devout, because he had a copy of the Bible in Braille. And so Ajit asked him, where'd you get this Bible? And his colleague said it was from a church in the United States. And so Ajit and his friends thought, well, what happens if we reach out to this church? And they did that. And then this church, perhaps thinking that they have finally found a lovely stronghold, sent them many, many copies of the Bible, which did not stop after they sent it, because they just continuously got copies of really good non-blotting paper, the Bible, which they used as shelf lining, research material, and so on and so forth. Now, I share this because I don't mean any disrespect for the church. In fact, I feel like, I've been evangelizing for them more than anyone else, perhaps. But through this, you start to see other layers, right? You start to see that there's a layer of resourcefulness, there's a layer of evangelism, there's a layer of ecological conservation, the population of tree-living mammals, the chemistry of paper, if you're a material scientist like I was in a previous life. So it's endless once you start paying attention to the layers of information in any object. So yeah, I mean, every object does this for me. It's never ending and it's a thrill.
Wow, that was very interesting. Well, thank you. So once again, thank you for the for sharing anecdotes and details about this very interesting endeavor. We really enjoyed your talk. And with that question, the live session comes to a close. However, as always, the discussion continues at the Slack forum. So please head to the Slack channel that we've set up for you. You should have received a link in your chat box. Our speakers will join you there to answer your questions or to further the discussions that we started here. In the meantime, from the Life Sciences Across the Globe team, a very big thank you to our participants today, Professor Mayer, Dr. Raghu, and Bhavna, and Venkat for the insightful talk and discussion. We would also like to thank our audience today for joining us and for participating in the discussion. Next week, Life Sciences Across the Globe will visit our sister institute at the Center for Life Sciences, where we'll hear from Dr. Ying Liu about mitochondrial stress response, and Dr. Wei Ji, who will talk about the role of chromatin reprogramming in early development. We hope to see everyone there. Until then, this is goodbye from Janelia Research Campus. See you next week.